If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. I have made this video in collaboration with the Court's Sense, an interesting YouTube channel specializing in political science and philosophy, so go check it out. The link is in the description. One of the aspects of the massive population aging and decline I have not yet fully explored, but that certainly deserves such an exploration, are the ideological and, thus also, the political implications of this phenomenon. Can liberal democracy, the default political and ideological regime throughout the contemporary West, survive the massive structural demographic changes that are currently taking place in many developed countries? Demographics influence the ideological, political, and overall societal discourse much more than most people appreciate. People in different age brackets think and act very differently from each other, and the relative share of various age groups within the population thus significantly influences the overall development and collective behavior of different societies. American author Christopher Caldwell pointed out that the sheer demographic mass of the American baby boomer generation was so vast that the country's overall political and cultural atmosphere was defined by the current interests of the baby boomer generation, both politically and commercially. So, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when baby boomers started entering their late teens, America was really into free love and recreational psychedelics. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, when baby boomers were in their 30s and 40s, it was really into workaholism and making money. And in the last decade or so, when the baby boomers started to retire, America is really into protecting investments. The baby boomers' demographic domination is much more pronounced in European countries like Italy or Germany, where the fertility collapse after the end of the baby boom was even more significant. Contemporary Europe is a prime example of a continent that profoundly lacks the youthful, creative energy that tends to push things forward culturally, technologically, and economically. One of the fundamental problems of our times is that society cannot reasonably function if it prioritizes the interests of the infertile and economically unproductive segment of society over the interests of the fertile and economically productive segment of society. But how can one person, one vote style democracy cope with a situation in which the infertile and, on average, economically unproductive strata of the society wield much more electoral power than the young people? Can liberalism survive if it is planting the seeds of its demise by leading to profoundly unsustainable demographics? What ideological and political shapes might some kind of backlash against the disastrous demographic trends take? And how could the fact that the ever-shrinking younger generations in European countries are also exceedingly ethnically and culturally diverse play into it all? Well, those are some interesting questions indeed. Let's get to it. Liberal democracy is the ruling ideology of the 20th and so far the 21st centuries. After the end of the Cold War, it enjoyed 3 decades of undisputed hegemony throughout the Western world, and the vast majority of countries throughout the world now claim to be democratic. Clearly, many countries claiming to be democratic are not, but it shows that democracy is the political ideology that is seen and, most importantly, sees itself as most legitimate. So much that even the anti-democratic dictators of the world must cloak themselves in the language and rituals of democracy. Vladimir Putin must stage elections in Russia every 6 years to reinforce his legitimacy before the people of Russia and the world. And let's not forget that the official name of the North Korean regime, basically a hereditary totalitarian monarchy, is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That is a reflection of the ideological hegemony of democracy. If a state wants to be seen as legitimate, it often strives to be seen as democratic. In the same way that if we lived in a world dominated by Catholicism, all the heads of states would have to justify their power by appealing to the divine right given to them by God. This hegemony of liberal democracy results from its great success in the last 150 years. Democracy defeated both fascism and communism in the Second World War and the Cold War, while it produced stability, relative freedom, and great amounts of wealth for its citizens. In the next decades, we will see that the demographic decline in most Western countries will bring about many economic and social difficulties that will deeply change Western democracies. But what will be the main problems? And do they have the capacity to kickstart history and bring about new ideologies? Famous British historian Niall Ferguson recently said that the rising popularity of socialism, Marxism, or other far-left ideologies among the young generations of Westerners shows a profound lack of understanding of self-interest among these young people. What does he mean by that? Well, young people in the contemporary West mostly believe they will be economically worse off than their parents. That is well documented by many researchers. And it is fair to acknowledge that there are some genuine reasons why they feel that way, and why it likely is more than just a feeling. If you are a young person entering the workforce today, buying a home, which many perceive as the cornerstone of starting a family, is much harder than it used to be for their parents or grandparents. In most Western countries, home prices to income ratios have risen markedly since the 1970s or 1980s. In some countries, they have more than doubled. I have recently seen a study that claims that British house prices in relation to incomes are the highest since 1876. And it is, of course, important to note that the national average house price to income ratios are often skewed by rural areas without that many job opportunities, and the situation in large cities where the jobs are situated is significantly worse. So, while the 2015 Canadian house price to income ratio, meaning the average annual income needed to buy an average price home, was about 4, it was close to 11 in Vancouver. You can probably buy a property somewhere on the prairie, but not everyone can live there and work in oil or agriculture or something. It was 5.6 for Australia as a whole and over 12 for Sydney, 3.5 for the United States and 8 for Los Angeles. The picture will be relatively similar pretty much everywhere. Now, the massive rise in property prices is a complex issue that cannot be attributed to one single cause, but what definitely plays a role is the massive amount of money printing that the Western governments have engaged in the past couple of decades, especially since the 2008 financial crisis. The phenomenon of negative interest rates and quantitative easing then peaked during the COVID pandemic, when the money supply massively grew in most Western countries. When governments print money not backed by the output of the economy, people use the money to buy assets, homes, real estate, stocks or whatever. So when the government prints money, asset prices go up. People already owning these assets thus get much richer, and wage earners without assets get comparatively poorer. Money printing thus increases economic inequality. The assets, especially homes, are overwhelmingly owned by the older generations of homeowners, who often bought their homes decades ago when the prices were much more reasonable. Every time public finances end up in a deficit, meaning the government spends more than it collects in taxes, it contributes to this phenomenon. Now, let's look at what the governments are spending the cash, often created by money printing, on. Looking at any Western country, you will see that two items are by far the most significant government expenses: pensions and healthcare. Both of these services are heavily tilted towards the elderly population. The pensions are self-explanatory, but healthcare is also a service that, if publicly funded, means huge money transfers from economically active people to the elderly. Sure, we all need healthcare, even young people, but on average, we just need significantly less than the elderly. In Western aging societies, people over 60 usually account for more than half of all healthcare expenditures, while constituting around 20% of the population. It gets even more extreme with people over 80. These groups are going to grow significantly in all Western countries. In Europe, people over 80 will often constitute over 10% of the population. As usual, it will be even worse in East Asia. So, what am I getting at? The current Western welfare state represents, to a certain extent, a massive transfer of money from the younger to the older people. That is what Niall Ferguson meant when he said that young people today do not really understand their economic interests if they support socialism. They correctly see that the system is rigged against them, but they cannot identify the problem. It is not capitalism, it is gerontocracy. You are heavily taxed, but the money is spent primarily on services for the elderly, not on supporting young families or education. Money is being printed to pay for pensions and healthcare, which makes housing completely unaffordable for you, while it increases the value of older homeowners' property. In my opinion, the most rational economic policy for young people to support in the contemporary West definitely isn't one supporting more economic redistribution like socialism. On the contrary, if the redistributed taxpayers' money is not being spent on you, wouldn't it be better if you could just keep your money and try to build your own fortune somehow? You might accuse me of having a right-wing bias, and fair enough, I do, but when I examine demonize the actual spending of the aging countries' governments, it just seems rational to me. There is almost no age consciousness in the sense there is a class consciousness or ethnic consciousness, even though I would argue that the conflict between the interests of different age groups is likely the most influential today. And I by no means mean this as an attack on the older generations, since it is not their fault. The fact that the average life expectancy almost doubled in the last 100 years is just a positive biological fact. And yes, you could theoretically blame them for not having enough children or not voting to reform the system, but let's be real. Most people just won't vote for policies that would significantly lower their living standards and make their lives harder if given a choice. It is hard to blame them for it, since it is a rational thing to do. That is not some conspiracy by the older generations against the young. It is just a collision of the democratic welfare state system with an unsustainable demographic structure. When the Western democratic institutions and welfare states were designed, the demographic reality was completely different. Life expectancy was usually a couple of years higher than the retirement age, and birth rates were between 2 and 3 children per woman. In fact, when the first old age pension system was designed in the 1880s German Empire, the retirement age was higher than the life expectancy, so relatively few people actually lived to see some of the pension payments. We are entering a previously unknown demographic terrain here, since in 20 or 30 years, the 18 to 50 years age bracket, so basically the fertile years combined with the large chunk of the economically most productive years of one's life, will be smaller than the 50 plus years age bracket in most democratic developed countries. Electorally, it will be almost impossible to push through the massive reforms of publicly financed systems needed to keep the system afloat, since the block of voters who are either retired or getting close to retirement will be bigger than everyone else. Sure, not all people will vote purely on their personal economic interests. Some will be economically independent of the state, and some will keep the best interests of their country in mind, especially if they have children. But many won't. The current young generation of Western women is almost certainly going to be the most childless generation in recorded history. In the United States, a recent study predicted that by 2030, 45% of women aged 25 to 44 will be childless. I think it won't be that different in large parts of Europe, and it will definitely be worse in East Asia. Childless people have different perspectives on the world, and the continuity of the system will be, on average, less important for them in comparison with people who have children. So we will see societies with a massive need for major reforms, combined with electorates that will be very easily persuaded to vote for politicians who promise them they won't implement the painful changes, since the people deserve decent pensions, free healthcare and all that. Yes, people might deserve it all, but the demographic reality just won't allow it. We are now entering a demographic situation in which there aren't going to be any painless solutions for most countries. Either politicians can prioritize the age groups that work, pay taxes, have children, and thus ensure the biological continuation of the national ethnic group and culture, serve in the military and police, and overall carry the states on their shoulders. But then, he likely just won't win the elections. Or he can prioritize the older half, people who cannot have children anymore, and are either retired or are still working, but as the retirement age is coming closer, it is getting more sensitive to potential changes in the pension system status quo. And voila! He wins the election. I have no illusions about how the current European political elite will behave when confronted with this dilemma. What might be the consequences? The continuous prioritization of issues benefiting the increasingly elderly populations will inevitably contribute to the loss of legitimacy of the whole system among the youth. It is, to a certain extent, already happening, but I think that so far, the connection between the aging population and the increasing amount of economic hardship that young people face has not really been made in the minds of most people. I would also argue that the mental distance between the problems that the current younger generations are facing versus the worldview held by the older people growing up long before the internet age has to be one of the most pronounced in modern history. One of the interesting elements of the current political development in Western countries is a profound gender divide in the political views of young people. In many European countries, as well as in America, young men increasingly turn towards the populist right parties, while young women turn towards the progressive green left. The center seems to hollow out, but men and women are choosing different paths out of the center. Both paths are potentially highly illiberal. I have no doubt that many environmentalists would go authoritarian without hesitation, if it would mean reaching net zero soon enough. And if you spend some time in the online right-wing bubble, it is anything but liberal. It points to one thing: the liberal democratic ideology that has been dominant since the Second World War seems to be losing attractivity and legitimacy. And as can be demonstrated by the incredible success of radical apocalyptic environmentalist ideologies among the contemporary European youth, people are longing for some type of ideological fulfillment. The void left within the European soul by the death of Christianity needs to be filled with something. Otherwise, people are mentally drifting towards aimless, hedonistic depression. The question remains whether the future economic hardships stemming from aging populations will be correctly blamed on the demographic situation, and whether the demographic situation will be blamed on the political system as a whole. Now, it is fair to acknowledge that blaming the demographic decline on liberalism is actually not entirely correct, since industrialization, urbanization, and education are really to blame. Many illiberal countries struggle with low birth rates, for example Russia, China, or Iran. The only developed and industrialized country not struggling with subreplacement fertility is Israel. But people are perfectly capable of making wrong causational judgments. Now, I'm going to get a little bit speculative, but I believe that there is a relatively solid chance for the creation of some kind of new political ideology based on the glorification of youth, fertility, and a rejection of the liberal democratic order, probably combined with nativist ethnic nationalism. So far, the concern about the demographic condition of the native populations was almost exclusively the domain of the political right, while the progressive left often holds environmentally determined anti-natalist approaches. This, to a certain extent, overlaps with the emerging ideological schism between young men and women, something that is especially damaging to birth rates. One of the principal questions of the coming decades is whether this barrier will be overcome. Hopefully yes. Now let's try to imagine Europe 20 or 30 years from now. The economic decline of Europe only deepens in the meantime. The publicly financed healthcare and pension systems, together with the servicing of the already huge public debts, are swallowing massive amounts of taxpayers' money. The demographic development is only getting worse, and the fertility rates are very low, just as people born around now, often the smallest generations ever, are entering the workforce and the reproductive age, leading to continuous downward birth rate spiral. Working age people are under an incredibly heavy tax burden, collected in order to pay for the collapsing system of the welfare state designed for the average age of 30 years. Wave after wave of immigration from Africa and the Middle East, regions with booming populations, will only exacerbate the European demographic anxiety. At this point, at least a third of the youth in many European countries will be of non-European background, often more. That will only deepen the feeling of cultural fragmentation as well as the economic melee, since people of many non-Western backgrounds, especially from Africa, Middle East, Turkey and Pakistan, are, on average, a clear net economic loss for the host countries, as was calculated in several Western European states. At this point, a question might arise in many people's minds. Is the system that had led to such a disastrous demographic development the best and most legitimate one? Is the system in which we are being constantly overvoted by the interests of the older generations really the best one? Now, one of the questions I have been thinking about repeatedly is how democratic we really are. Is democracy really that important to us? I would argue that a lot of countries did not become democratic because their populations were deeply and thoroughly convinced that democracy is the best system of governance, but mostly because it was the system connected to by far the most successful part of the world in modern history, the West and especially the Anglosphere. It was seen as legitimate since democratic states were very successful. In Germany, Italy and Japan, democracy was basically installed by foreign military occupation forces after the countries lost the Second World War. An absolutely positive view of democracy is also one of the most dogmatically upheld positions in the current Western Overton window. To publicly criticize democracy or to suggest that another way of governance might be better is still completely unacceptable in all Western countries. If we look at the family type classification by Emmanuel Todd, he argues that only the countries with the historical nuclear family type, where parents do not exercise overbearing authority over their children way into adulthood, are really anthropologically equipped for democracy. Within Europe, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, Poland and Romania have either a majority or a significant part of their populations with historically nuclear family types. The rest of the continent comes from traditionally authoritarian families with the father's authority over his children. modern. If it should be the guideline to show us a glimpse of the future, we might see democracy surviving on the Atlantic seafront, from Norway in the north to the Iberian Peninsula in the south, with Central and Eastern Europe, with the possible exceptions of Poland and Romania, sliding to some kind of authoritarianism. Now, the family type division obviously cannot be seen as some kind of divine truth showing us the future. It is merely an interesting lens through which one can try to predict it, most likely unsuccessfully. But what is certain is that the demographic cocktail, consisting of a rapidly increasing proportion of the elderly, a rapidly declining proportion of young people, and rapidly rising ethnic diversity, is very explosive indeed. Since the Second World War, two simultaneous demographic and political phenomena have occurred. First is a massive rise of intra-societal, very often ethnically charged, military conflicts in proportion to interstate military conflicts. Up to 1955, the ratio of violent conflicts that could be classified as interstate, so the war between two sovereign states, to those that could be classified as intra-societal, was roughly 1-to-1. By the early 1990s, the latter was outstripping the former by roughly 6-to-1. Studies suggest that of 139 wars fought between 1945 and 2008, 57% were unambiguously ethnic, and a further 17% were mixed, and the proportion of conflicts that were ethnic rose every decade. The reason for this is most likely the politicization of ethnicity that occurred due to the dramatic expansion of democracy since 1945, which is the second notable phenomenon. The demographic composition of a country becomes significantly more crucial for its functioning under democracy. To quote the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz, the institution of universal suffrage makes the temptation to court the masses by appealing to tribal loyalties virtually irresistible. If a country has an increasingly ethnically diverse population, and this diversity is allowed to be politically used by tribal instincts to gain electoral gains, democracy will slowly become more unstable. There are too many variables in this equation to make any kind of concrete predictions for specific countries. But all things considered, the likelihood that societal conflicts throughout the West will still be decided mainly in the voting booths is getting less likely every year.